She fed the outlaw for weeks, never asking his name, until she saw the scar and remembered the night her family died. The first bowl went out at sunset, when the light turned everything the color of old blood. Martha set it on the windowsill like she was placing an offering on a grave. Steam rose from the beans and cornbread, curling into the evening air that still tasted of ash 3 months after the fire. She did not look toward the ruins of the barn where she knew he was hiding. She did not call out or wait to see if he would come. She simply turned her back and walked to the far side of her kitchen, where the shadows were thick enough to hide in. By morning, the bowl was empty and clean, sitting exactly where she had left it. She had first seen him 4 days ago, a dark shape moving through the skeletal remains of what used to be her husband's workshop. At first, she thought it was a coyote, or maybe her eyes playing tricks in the heat shimmer that rose from the blackened ground. But coyotes did not move with such careful purpose, and her eyes had never lied to her about danger. He was hurt. She could tell by the way he favored his left side, the way he rested too long against the charred fence posts. Blood had a smell to it, sharp and metallic, and the wind carried it to her kitchen window along with the dust and the memory of smoke. She should have loaded her husband's rifle, should have ridden to town and told Sheriff Morgan there was a stranger on her land, should have done any number of things that made sense for a woman alone with nothing left to lose. Instead, she made beans. The second night, she added meat to the bowl, salt pork that she had been saving, rationing out like prayers. She told herself it was Christian charity, the kind her mother had taught her before the consumption took her voice and then her breath. But charity was supposed to feel lighter than this, was supposed to lift the soul instead of settling in the chest like stone. She watched from behind her thin curtains as he emerged from the ruins. He moved like a man accustomed to being hunted, quick and low, checking the horizon before stepping into the open. Even from a distance, she could see the fever bright in his eyes, the way pain made his movements sharp and desperate. He was young, younger than she had expected, maybe 25, maybe less. Old enough to have killed, young enough to still dream about it at night. The empty bowl appeared at dawn, clean as baptism. On the third night, she left coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory brew that most folks had grown used to. She had been saving it for a special occasion that seemed less and less likely to come. The tin sat on her shelf like a promise she could not keep to herself, so she kept it to him instead. She found herself listening for his footsteps, though the ground was too hard and he too careful to make much sound. Still, she knew when he came and when he went, the way she had always known when storms were coming or when the milk was about to turn. Some knowledge lived in the bones, deeper than thought. The fourth night brought rain. Not the gentle kind that blessed the earth, but the hard, driving drops that turned dust to mud and made the world smell like metal and regret. She set the bowl out anyway, covering it with a cloth that had once been white, but now bore the permanent stains of too much living. Through the rain, she saw him clearly for the first time. He was taller than she had thought, with dark hair that hung wet against his neck. His clothes were torn and travel-stained, the kind of ruin that spoke of hard miles and harder choices. But it was his hands that caught her attention as he reached for the bowl. They were gentleman's hands, long-fingered and careful, not the blunt tools of a working man. What was a gentleman doing bleeding in her burn barn? She almost called out to him, then, almost broke the silence that had become their only conversation. The words gathered in her throat like birds before flight. But something in his stillness warned her away from speaking. Some people carried quiet like a weapon, and she had learned to respect armed men. The rain stopped before midnight, leaving the world clean and strange. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to water drip from the eaves, and wondered if he was dry in whatever shelter he had made among the ruins. She wondered if his fever had broken, if his wounds were healing, if he would disappear into the dawn and leave her with nothing but empty bowls and questions. She wondered why she hoped he would not. Morning brought the bowl back, clean and empty, but this time there was something else. A single wildflower, prairie rose the color of sunset, laid carefully beside the rim. She picked it up with fingers that trembled only slightly and held it to the light streaming through her kitchen window. It had been picked fresh, the stems still bleeding sap. He had been awake in the darkness before dawn, moving through her land with enough care to find beauty and enough trust to offer it. The thought sat strange in her chest, warm and uncomfortable as whiskey drunk too fast. That evening, she added honey to the cornbread. Just a drizzle, enough to make it shine gold in the lamplight. She set the bowl on the windowsill and stepped back, but this time she did not retreat to the shadows. This time, she stood where he could see her if he looked. He looked. For just a moment, their eyes met through the glass and the gathering dusk. His were dark as old coffee, tired as winter, and filled with something that might have been gratitude or might have been sorrow. She could not tell the difference anymore. She lifted her hand in the smallest of waves, and he nodded once before melting back into the ruins of her former life. The flower sat on her kitchen table in a jar of water, its petals already beginning to curl at the edges, and Martha wondered what kind of man picked roses in the dark. The fever took him on the 7th night, when a moon was nothing but a sliver of bone in the black sky. Martha found him collapsed beside the water trough, his body twisted like something the wind had dropped. The empty bowl lay shattered in the dirt, beans scattered like dark promises that would never be kept. His skin burned hot enough to brand, and when she touched his forehead, he jerked away with a sound that was more animal than man. She should have left him there, should have walked back to her kitchen and pretended the morning would bring an empty yard and a clear conscience. But fever was a thief that stole choices along with sense, and she found herself hauling water from the well with hands that remembered other sickbeds, other lost causes. The barn was too dangerous, too exposed to wind and curious eyes. So she dragged him to the root cellar, that cool, dark space beneath her kitchen where potatoes had once waited for winter and now only spiders kept house. It took all her strength and most of her breath to get him down the wooden steps, his dead weight pulling at muscles that had grown weak from too much solitude. She made a bed from horse blankets and old quilts, the kind of rough comfort that had to serve when gentle was a luxury. He muttered against the darkness, words in Spanish and English that tumbled together like water over stones. Names she did not recognize, places that existed only in his fever dreams. The crows came with the dawn, black shapes that settled on the fence posts like mourners at a wake. They watched the house with bright, knowing eyes, heads tilted as if listening for secrets. Martha had always hated crows. They remembered too much and forgot too little, carrying stories in their wings that were better left buried. She boiled water and tore clean cloth into strips, the methodical work of tending that all women learned whether they wanted to or not. His wounds were old but angry, the kind that came from metal and malice. Someone had tried to kill him, and they had come close to succeeding. The question was whether they had good reason. His hands fascinated her in the lamplight. Those long, careful fingers were scarred now, marked by rope burns and blade cuts that spoke of desperate fights and narrow escapes. But underneath the damage, she could still see what they had been, the hands of someone who had known books and music, who had held things gently because he could afford to. What had driven a gentleman to bleeding in strangers' root cellars? By the second day, the fever dreams began in earnest. He spoke to people who were not there, argued with ghosts only he could see. Sometimes his voice was soft, pleading. Other times it cracked with rage that made the small space feel dangerous. "Sarah," he whispered to the darkness, and Martha felt something cold touch her spine. "Sarah, take the children and run." She knew that tone, had heard it in her own nightmares, in the voices of men who had learned too late that evil wore familiar faces. It was the sound of someone trying to save what could not be saved, fighting battles that had already been lost. On the third day, he screamed. The sound tore up from the root cellar and through the floorboards, raw and desperate as a wounded animal. Martha dropped the cup she was washing and ran down the stairs, expecting to find him dying or dead or gone completely mad. Instead, she found him sitting up, eyes wide and staring at something she could not see. His face was wet with tears and sweat, and his whole body shook like a tree in a storm. The fire, he said, his voice broken glass. I couldn't stop the fire. She knelt beside him then, this strange man who picked flowers in the dark and cried for people named Sarah. His skin was still hot, but the dangerous edge of fever had passed, leaving behind something rawer and more human. It's over, she told him, though she did not know what it was. Whatever happened, it's over now. He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. His eyes were the color of coffee grounds, dark and bitter and full of grounds that would never settle. No, he said quietly. It's never over. Fire has a long memory. She brought him broth and water, feeding him like a child because his hands shook too badly to hold the spoon. He ate without tasting, mechanical as a machine that had been wound too tight for too long. But when she tried to leave, his fingers caught her wrist with desperate strength. Don't go, he said. Please. I can't be alone with them. With who? But he had already turned his face to the wall, and she knew he would not answer. Some truths were too heavy to speak aloud, too sharp to handle without cutting yourself on the edges. She stayed, sat on an overturned crate, and watched him sleep while the crows gathered outside, their calls echoing through the floorboards like accusations. His dreams were violent things that made him twitch and mumble, fighting wars that existed only in the country of memory. Sometimes she thought she heard other voices in his ramblings. A woman singing, children laughing, the ordinary sounds of a life that had been lived before it was lost. On the fourth day, he woke clear-eyed and quiet. The fever had broken in the night, leaving him pale and hollow, but human again. He sat up carefully, testing his body like a man, relearning how to inhabit his own skin. Thank you, he said, and his voice was different now. Steadier, sadder. She nodded and turned to go, but his next words stopped her cold. I know what you're thinking, he said to her back. You're wondering if I deserve saving. Martha's hand tightened on the wooden rail of the stairs. Outside, the crows called to each other in their harsh language, sharing secrets that only scavengers knew. The answer, he continued, soft as a prayer, is probably not. She saw it when she was changing his bandages on the fifth morning, a white slash across his left shoulder that caught the lamplight like a brand. The scar was old, maybe 10 years healed, raised and twisted in the particular way that spoke of a blade drawn deep and left to fester. But it was not the age that made her hands freeze on the bloody cloth. It was the shape, a crescent moon with a jagged tail, unmistakable as a signature written in flesh. The lamp trembled in her grip, casting dancing shadows on the root cellar walls. Time folded in on itself like paper, and suddenly she was 15 again, pressed flat against the floorboards of her family's cabin, while hell painted the sky orange outside. Her mother's voice, steady and sure even with smoke filling her lungs. Martha, you stay down. No matter what you hear, you stay down. The riders had come at midnight, 6 men with faces hidden behind bandanas and intentions written in the fire they carried. Her father had tried to meet them at the door, shotgun in hand and righteousness in his voice. It had not been enough. It was never enough when evil came calling with friends. She had watched through the cracks in the floorboards as they dragged him outside, had seen her mother's skirts disappear through the doorway, heard the sound of hands striking flesh and voices raised in cruel laughter. But it was the leader she remembered most clearly, the one who had torn his shirt on her father's dying swing and bled silver in the firelight. The same scar that now lay exposed beneath her trembling fingers. Thomas Crenshaw. That was the name whispered in saloons and shouted in courtrooms, the ghost that mothers used to frighten children into bed. The man who had burned her world to ash and scattered her family to the wind like seeds that would never grow. He stirred beneath her touch, and she jerked her hands away as if his skin had turned to flame. His eyes opened slowly, still heavy with sleep and healing, and found her face in the lamp's glow. Something wrong? He asked, and his voice was different now that she knew who he was. Softer than she remembered. Sadder. She could not speak, could not breathe. The air in the small space had turned thick as tar, heavy with the weight of recognition and the bitter taste of old grief. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a bird trying to escape its cage. He was smaller than she remembered. 10 years had carved lines around his eyes, and turned his hair gray at the temples. The fever had hollowed his cheeks and stolen the dangerous grace she remembered from that terrible night. He looked almost human now, almost fragile, almost like someone worth saving. "You're afraid of me," he said, and it was not a question. His dark eyes searched her face, reading the truth written there in the language of tension and retreat. "You know who I am." She nodded because lies seemed impossible in the close air between them, because some truths were too heavy to deny, even when speaking them might break what little peace she had managed to build from the ruins of her old life. He closed his eyes and let his head fall back against the makeshift pillow. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What was your name then?" "Before." "Martha Riley," she said, and the words tasted like ash on her tongue. "My father was James Riley. My mother was Catherine." He was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen back to sleep. But when she looked closer, she could see the wetness on his cheeks, silver tracks that caught the lamplight and made him look younger than his years. "I remember them," he said finally. "I remember your father's courage, your mother's prayers." The lamp flickered, casting wild shadows that made the small space feel even smaller. Outside, she could hear the crows calling to each other, their voices harsh and knowing in the pre-dawn darkness. "Why?" The word escaped her before she could stop it, raw and desperate as a child's plea. "Why did you do it?" He opened his eyes and looked at her then, really looked, as if he was trying to memorize her face for a journey he would take alone. "Because I was young and stupid and thought I knew the difference between justice and revenge," he said. "Because someone told me your father had killed my brother, and I believed them without asking questions. Because I was everything you think I am and worse." She could feel the weight of her husband's rifle upstairs, waiting by the kitchen door where she had left it every night for 3 months. It would be easy to fetch it, to end this conversation in this strange, twisted mercy that had brought her here. Justice was supposed to be clean and simple, a balance that could be restored with lead and powder. But her hands remembered other things now. The way he had cried for someone named Sarah in his fever dreams. The gentleness with which he had accepted her care, never demanding, never assuming he deserved it. The prairie rose he had picked in the darkness, an offering of beauty when he had nothing else to give. "Was it true?" she asked. "About your brother?" "No." The word fell between them like a stone into still water. "James Riley never killed anybody. He was exactly what he seemed, a good man trying to protect his family from monsters like me." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of wasted years and choices that could never be undone. Outside, the crows grew quiet, as if even they understood that some moments required reverence. "I've spent 10 years trying to die for what I did that night," he said, his voice steady now, resigned. "But dying's harder than it looks when you're a coward." Martha stared at the scar on his shoulder, that twisted reminder of violence done and prices paid. Her finger traced the air above it, not quite touching, remembering the silver flash of blade and the red promise of revenge. But revenge was a young woman's dream, and she was no longer young. "What's your real name?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know. "Samuel," he said as the first light crept through the kitchen window. "My name is Samuel Morrison." Martha stood at the stove, her back to him, stirring porridge that neither of them would have much appetite for. The wooden spoon moved in slow circles, keeping time with thoughts that had no rhythm, no sense, no easy ending. Samuel Morrison, not Thomas Crenshaw, the name that had lived in her nightmares for 10 years. Just Samuel, a man who had climbed the stairs from her root cellar on unsteady legs and sat at her kitchen table like any other guest who had nowhere else to go. She had helped him up those stairs, her arm around his waist when his strength failed, feeling the heat of fever that still clung to his skin like a stubborn ghost. He was lighter than she had expected, hollowed out by sickness and whatever weight he had been carrying since that night when her world burned. "Samuel Morrison," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It tasted different than she thought it would. Cleaner, somehow. More human. "I made up Thomas Crenshaw when I was 17 and stupid," he said to her back. "Thought it sounded dangerous. Thought dangerous was what I wanted to be." She turned then, the spoon still in her hand, and looked at him properly in the morning light. The fever had left him pale and drawn, but his eyes were clear now, steady in a way that made her think of deep water, the kind that reflected back whatever you brought to it. "What do you want to be now?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time, staring down at his hands where they rested on her scarred wooden table. Those long fingers that had once held guns and torches now trembled slightly, whether from weakness or something else she could not say. "Gone," he said finally. "I want to be gone from this world and from the harm I've done in it." She set the porridge on the table between them, two bowls that steamed in the cool morning air. The silence stretched long and heavy, filled with the small sounds of life continuing despite everything. The tick of the clock on the mantel, the distant call of a meadowlark, the whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls. "I used to dream about killing you," Martha said, and the words came easier than she had expected. "Every night for the first 2 years. I would plan it out, step by step, where I would find you, what I would say, how I would make you hurt the way you made my family hurt." Samuel picked up a spoon, but did not eat, just held it like a man who had forgotten what it was for. "You should have," he said. "If our places were switched, I think I would have." "Maybe." She tasted the porridge, bland and necessary as grief. "But then I met Henry, and we married, and built this place from nothing. And somewhere in all that building, the dreams started to fade." She looked around the kitchen that had been her sanctuary for 3 years, before the fire took Henry and left her alone with memories and empty rooms. The morning light made everything golden, even the worn places and the scars. "I learned something about revenge during those years," she continued. "It's like a fire that burns everything around it, including the person who sets it. And I had already lost enough to fire." Samuel finally took a bite, chewing slowly as if food was something his body had to remember how to want. When he swallowed, it looked like an effort. "So what now?" he asked. "You could still turn me in? Sheriff Morgan would be glad to see me hang. Most folks would call it justice." "Most folks weren't there that night," Martha said. "Most folks didn't watch their father die, try and protect a family that couldn't be protected." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ruins of the barn where he had hidden for a week, bleeding and alone. The morning sun turned the charred timbers silver, beautiful in the way that only broken things could be when the light hit them just right. "I keep thinking about something my mother used to say," she said to the glass. "She used to tell me that every day we wake up, we get to choose who we want to be. The person we were yesterday doesn't have to be the person we are today. Your mother was a wise woman." She was. And she was also dead at 35 because a 17-year-old boy chose to be someone dangerous instead of someone good. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and true as any blade. Samuel set down his spoon and pushed the bowl away, barely touched. "I can't give you back your family," he said. "I can't undo what I did or take back the years you spent learning to live with it. I can't even promise that hanging me would make the world a better place, because I'm not sure it would. Then what can you give me?" He looked at her then, this man who had been both monster and patient, enemy and guest, the source of her nightmares and the recipient of her mercy. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing but the truth of what I am now, and the promise that the boy who burned your world is already dead, has been dead for a long time." Martha watched a hawk circle high above the ruined barn, riding the morning thermals with wings that barely moved. Such grace in that effortless flight, such peace in the way it accepted whatever the wind offered. "The boy is dead," she said finally, "but you're still here. Yes, and you're still hungry." She turned back to the table and sat down across from him, pushing his bowl closer to his hands. "Then eat," she said, "and we'll see what kind of man you choose to be with a full belly and a second chance." Outside, the hawk called once and disappeared into the endless sky, leaving nothing behind but the memory of wings and the promise that some things, at least, knew how to let go.